The morning rush at Luna's brew always tested Kira's carefully constructed facade. Steam hissed from the espresso machine as she moved with practiced efficiency, her pale skin appearing human under the warm cafe lighting. Her vibrant red hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she'd learned to move with the deliberate slowness humans expected rather than the fluid grace that came naturally to her Zilani heritage. "Double shot Americano, extra hot," she called out, sliding the cup across the granite counter. The businessman barely looked up from his phone as he grabbed his drink and hurried toward the door. Another anonymous face in the endless parade of customers who saw her as nothing more than the girl who made their coffee. That was exactly how she preferred it. The bell above the door chimed again, and Kira glanced up to see him, the man who'd been coming in every Tuesday and Friday for the past month, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that showed threads of silver at the temples and eyes the color of deep space. Unlike the other regulars who barely acknowledged her existence, this one watched her. Not in the leering way some men did, but with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. "The usual?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully modulated to match the Pacific Northwest accent she'd perfected. "Please." His voice was warm, professional. "Medium dark roast, black." She turned to the coffee station, hyper-aware of his presence behind her. Through the reflection in the chrome surface of the machine, she caught him studying her movements again. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured, a mistake she couldn't afford. "Beautiful morning," he said conversationally. Kira glanced through the large windows at the gray Seattle drizzle. "If you say so. You don't agree?" She handed him the steaming cup, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Rain's good for business. People need more caffeine when it's gloomy." He smiled at that, and something in his expression shifted. "Practical. I like that." The comment lingered in the air between them as he left his usual generous tip and headed for his regular table by the window. Kira tried to focus on the next customer, but she could feel his gaze on her throughout the morning. It wasn't until the lunch rush hit that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The lights had dimmed when a circuit breaker flipped, casting half the cafe in shadow. While the other customers squinted and pulled out their phones for light, he continued reading his newspaper without missing a beat. But more telling, she had moved through the dimness as if it were broad daylight, efficiently serving customers while her human co-workers fumbled in the reduced visibility. When she looked up, their eyes met across the cafe. He set down his newspaper deliberately and approached the counter, waiting as she finished with the customer ahead of him. "Kira," he said quietly, using the name on her badge. "Yes?" "My name is Jackson Cross." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was a commander in the Galactic Defense Fleet for 15 years. I've seen your kind before. Helped relocate 3 transport ships after the Zilani system fell." Her carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The cup in her hand slipped, but she caught it with reflexes too quick for human eyes. Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "You're doing an admirable job blending in," he continued, his tone gentle despite the earth-shattering nature of his words. "But you forgot to hide your night vision, and your reaction time is about 50 milliseconds faster than human average." Kira's mind raced through escape routes, contingency plans, the weight of the emergency cash hidden in her apartment. But, instead of reaching for his phone or calling for security, Jackson simply smiled. "I'm not here to expose you," he said. "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tomorrow night." Kira's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at Jackson Cross. The cafe continued bustling around them, oblivious to the fact that her entire carefully constructed life had just crumbled in a single conversation. Her first instinct screamed at her to run, grab her emergency bag, catch the next bus out of the city, disappear into another identity in another town. But something in his expression held her frozen. There was no malice, no triumphant gleam of discovery. Instead, his dark eyes held something that looked almost like understanding. She started, then stopped. What could she possibly say? Deny it? The evidence was written in her too quick reflexes and enhanced vision. "Take your time," Jackson said gently. I know this is overwhelming. The espresso machine hissed behind her, and she realized she was still holding the cup she'd nearly dropped. Her hands were shaking now, and she set it down carefully on the counter. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "I suspected after the second week. You have this way of tilting your head when you listen. It's a Zalani trait. And your posture, when you're concentrating, I've seen it before." He paused, his voice growing softer. "You carry yourself like someone who's trained for combat, not coffee service." Kira closed her eyes. On Zelan Prime, she had been a communications specialist with the Planetary Defense Corps. Before the star went unstable, before the evacuation, ships, before everything she'd ever known turned to ash and memory. "You said you helped with transport ships," she said, opening her eyes to study his face. Jackson nodded. The Horizon's Dawn, the New Sanctuary, and the Star's End. 3 months after the evacuation order went out. His expression grew somber. "I was the liaison officer helping coordinate refugee placement. I saw what your people went through." The weight of shared history settled between them. Kira had been on the New Sanctuary, one of the overcrowded vessels carrying survivors to various worlds throughout the galaxy. She remembered the GDF officers who had processed them with efficient kindness, helping traumatized refugees navigate a universe that suddenly had no place for them. "You were there," she said, not quite a question. "I was. And I saw how hard your people fought to rebuild, to find new homes, to survive." He leaned forward slightly. "What you've accomplished here, creating a new identity, building a life, it's remarkable." Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry in months suddenly threatened to spill over. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of her deception alone, the constant vigilance, the careful performance of humanity, the bone-deep loneliness of never being truly seen or known. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why tell me you know? Why not just leave it alone?" Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "Because I've been watching you for a month and I see how carefully you hold yourself apart, how you smile at customers but never let anyone get close." He met her eyes. "I know what it's like to feel disconnected from the world around you. You're human. You belong here." "Do I?" He gave a rueful smile. "I spent 15 years in space, fighting battles on worlds whose names I can barely pronounce. I've seen civilizations rise and fall, made decisions that affected entire star systems. Then the war ended, and suddenly I'm supposed to be content, discussing weather and sports scores over coffee. Understanding flickered between them. 2 people displaced from the lives they'd once known, trying to find their place in a world that felt foreign." "The dinner invitation," Kira said carefully. "Is that pity?" "It's attraction," he said simply, his honesty making her breath catch. "And admiration, and maybe a little bit of hope that 2 people who understand what it means to be strangers in their own lives might not have to be strangers to each other." The afternoon crowd was thinning, and Kira glanced at the clock. Her shift ended in an hour. An hour to decide whether to trust this man who claimed to see her, really see her, and still wanted to know more. "There's a small Italian place on Pine Street," she heard herself saying. "Mama Rosa's. Tomorrow at 7? Jackson's smile was like sunrise after a long, cold night. "I'll be there." As he gathered his things to leave, he paused at the counter. "Kira, what you've built here, this life, this identity, you should be proud of it, but you shouldn't have to carry it alone." After he left, Kira stood in the diminishing steam and warm light of the cafe, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that she might not have to hide anymore. Mama Rosa's was exactly the kind of place Kira had hoped it would be, dimly lit, tucked away from the main street, with intimate tables scattered throughout rooms that felt more like someone's home than a restaurant. She arrived 5 minutes early, her palms damp with nervousness, wearing a simple black dress that she'd agonized over for an hour. Jackson was already there, standing as she approached the table. He'd traded his usual casual clothes for dark slacks and a button-down shirt that brought out the deep blue of his eyes. The sight of him made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You came," he said, and she heard relief in his voice. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might run. He pulled out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy. I'm glad you didn't. They ordered wine, a bottle of Chianti that arrived with crusty bread and olive oil. For the first few minutes, they made careful small talk about the restaurant, the weather, anything that didn't touch on the revelation that hung between them. But as the wine loosened the tension in her shoulders, Kira found herself studying his hands as he gestured, the way he listened with complete attention, how he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about mundane things. Can I ask about your family? He said gently as their entrees arrived. On Xelon Prime. The question she'd been dreading. Kira set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. My parents were teachers, literature and stellar cartography. They were in the capital when the first solar flares hit the northern continent. Jackson reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I'm sorry. The simple contact sent warmth up her arm. When was the last time someone had touched her with tenderness? They died quickly. That's something, I suppose. She looked up, at him. The evacuation ship, were you there when they loaded the refugees? I was on the orbital platform, coordinating with the transport captains. His thumb traced across her knuckles. It was chaos. People carrying whatever they could grab, families separated in the crowd. I've never felt so helpless. You saved lives. Not enough of them. They sat in comfortable silence, their hands linked, across the white tablecloth. Kira felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of isolation she'd grown so accustomed to that she'd forgotten it was there. What was it like? Jackson asked. Growing up on Xelon Prime? For the first time in 3 years, Kira allowed herself to remember without pain. She told him about the crystal gardens that grew in spiraling towers toward the 3 moons, about the way her people sang together during the harvest festivals, how children learned to read stellar patterns before they could write their own names. As she spoke, she watched Jackson's face, seeing fascination and something deeper, a hunger to understand not just her world, but her. You miss it, he said, every day, but I'm learning to miss it differently now. She hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. For 3 years, remembering felt like dying all over again. Tonight it feels like honoring something beautiful that was lost. The wine and candlelight worked their magic as the evening progressed. Jackson told her about growing up on a farming planet in the outer colonies, about the restlessness that had driven him to join the GDF, about coming back to Earth and feeling like an alien in his own species' homeworld. I have an apartment overlooking the Sound, he said as they shared tiramisu. Some nights I stand on the balcony and look up at the stars trying to pick out the systems I've visited. It's probably the only time I feel like myself anymore. Show me, Kira said impulsively. I mean, if you want to. I'd like to see the stars through your eyes. The short walk to his building gave them both time to consider what they were really asking and offering. Kira's heart raced as they rode the elevator to the 15th floor, hyper-aware of Jackson's presence beside her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way he kept glancing at her as if she might disappear. His apartment was spartanly furnished, but comfortable, with wide windows facing west toward the water. He opened the sliding door to the balcony and they stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights below sparkled like earthbound stars, but above them, the real stars shimmered in the clear sky. There, Jackson said, moving behind her and pointing over her shoulder. That cluster? That's the Andorian system. I spent 6 months there negotiating a peace treaty between 2 colonies. Kira leaned back against his chest, feeling his warmth through her thin dress. The bright one just east of it. That's Kepler's star. We used to navigate by it during long-range missions. His arms came around her waist and she allowed herself to relax into his embrace. For the first time since leaving her homeworld, she felt safe enough to let her human disguise soften. The change was subtle, her skin taking on its natural pale green luminescence in the starlight, her hair catching the moonbeams with an otherworldly shimmer. Beautiful, Jackson whispered against her ear, and she knew he wasn't talking about the stars. She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the silver light. The desire she saw there matched her own. Not just physical attraction, but a deeper longing for connection, for understanding, for home. When he kissed her, it was soft and questioning at first, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, she melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as 3 years of careful control finally cracked open. He tasted like wine and possibility, like the first hope she'd allowed herself since her world died. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of discovery and growing intimacy. Jackson became a fixture at Luna's brew, timing his visits for Kira's breaks so they could steal conversations over shared pastries. He learned that she hummed while she worked, old Zilani melodies that sounded like wind through crystal formations. She discovered that he kept a small herb garden on his balcony and made surprisingly good pasta from scratch. Their first night together came after a dinner at his apartment. Kira had offered to cook, wanting to share something of her heritage, and had managed to adapt a traditional Zilani dish using earth ingredients. As they lingered over the meal, talking about everything and nothing, the familiar charge between them grew stronger. "I've been thinking," Jackson said, refilling their wine glasses, "about what it must be like, hiding so much of yourself every day." Kira traced patterns on the tablecloth, her finger leaving faint trails of bioluminescence that quickly faded. "It's exhausting sometimes, like wearing a costume that's too tight. You don't have to here with me." He caught her hand, lifting it to press a kiss to her palm. "I want to know all of you, Kira. Not just the human parts." Something broke open in her chest at those words. She stood, pulling him with her toward the bedroom, her decision made. In the soft lamplight, she let her human disguise fall away completely. Her skin took on its natural pale green radiance, the pattern of faint silver markings that traced her arms and shoulders becoming visible. Her red hair seemed to catch fire in the dim light, moving with an otherworldly fluidity. "This is me," she whispered, suddenly vulnerable. "This is what I really look like." Jackson's intake of breath was reverent. "You're magnificent." His hands mapped her differences with careful wonder, the way her skin felt like silk over steel, how the silver markings seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, the delicate points of her ears that made her gasp when he traced them with his tongue. She showed him how her people expressed affection, the gentle pressure points that sent electricity through her nervous system, the soft Zilani words that meant things English had no equivalent for. In return, she learned the geography of his body, the scars from battles on distant worlds, the way he responded when she whispered his name in her native language. They moved together with the careful intensity of two people who had been alone too long, desperate to memorize every sensation, every moment of connection. Afterward, as they lay tangled in his sheets, Kira traced the constellation of freckles across his chest. "On Zilan Prime, we believed that lovers carried pieces of each other's souls," she said softly. "When my people bonded, they could sense each other's emotions across great distances. Do you feel that? With me?" Jackson's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the hope underneath. Kira closed her eyes, reaching for the subtle awareness that had been growing stronger each day they spent together. There, a warm glow of contentment and protectiveness that wasn't quite her own. "Yes," she breathed, "I think I do." But their happiness was threatened a week later when Kira arrived at work to find her manager pale and shaken. 3 more missing persons reports came in last night, Elena said, showing Kira the news article on her phone. "All from the immigrant community. The police think it might be connected to those disappearances last month." Kira's blood went cold. The missing people had all been refugees. Not necessarily alien, but definitely not native-born Americans. Her carefully constructed sense of safety began to crumble. That evening, she called Jackson from her apartment, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. He arrived within 20 minutes, pulling her into his arms the moment she opened the door. "Tell me what's wrong," he said. And she realized he must have felt her distress through their growing bond. She showed him the news articles she'd been researching. 15 people missing over the past 2 months, all refugees or recent immigrants, all taken from locations near where she lived and worked. What if someone knows? What if they're targeting people like me? Jackson's expression turned grim. I still have contacts in the GDF intelligence division. Let me make some calls. As he worked his phone, pacing her small living room, Kira felt the walls closing in. She'd been a fool to think she could build a normal life, to believe she could trust someone with her secret. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear into a new identity in a new city before whatever was hunting refugees found her. But as she watched Jackson coordinating with his former colleagues, using every resource at his disposal to protect not just her, but all the vulnerable people in their community, she realized something had changed. For the first time since leaving her homeworld, she wasn't facing the danger alone. It's not government agents, Jackson said finally, ending his last call. There's a black market operation trafficking refugees. My contacts think they're being sold to collectors or research facilities off-world. The news was somehow both better and worse than her fears. What do? We stop them. Jackson's voice carried the authority of his former rank. And we make sure you and others like you are safe. As they planned their next move, Kira felt the bond between them strengthen. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town looked like dozens of others. Corrugated metal walls, broken windows, the kind of place that minded its own business. But according to Jackson's intelligence contacts, it was the hub of the trafficking operation that had been hunting refugees throughout the city. Kira adjusted the communication device in her ear, her heart racing as she approached the building. The plan was simple. She would pose as a vulnerable refugee seeking help, drawing out the traffickers while Jackson and a team of GDF operatives surrounded the building. Simple, but terrifyingly dependent on timing and luck. Remember, Jackson's voice whispered through the comm. At the first sign of trouble, you get out. Don't try to be a hero. I'll be careful, she whispered back. Though they both knew this was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. The man who answered her tentative knock looked exactly like what central casting would order for suspicious criminal. Heavy-set, scarred, with eyes that assessed her like merchandise. Yeah, I heard you help people like me, Kira said, letting her accent slip slightly, making herself seem more foreign, more vulnerable. People who need to disappear. His expression shifted to predatory interest. Depends what you got to pay with, sweetheart. I have some savings and I can work. Work's not what I had in mind. He stepped aside, gesturing her into the dimly lit interior. Come on in. Let's see what you're really worth. The warehouse was divided into makeshift cells, and Kira's heart clenched as she saw the faces peering out at her. Men, women, even a few teenagers, all with the hollow look of people who had lost hope. These were the missing refugees, waiting to be shipped off-world like cargo. Prime specimens, the man said conversationally, following her gaze. Amazing what some collectors will pay for exotic species. Rage flooded through Kira, and she felt an answering surge of fury from Jackson through their bond. These people weren't specimens or curiosities. They were survivors who had already lost everything once. Now let's see what you really are, the man continued, pulling out a scanner that would reveal her true nature. Can't have you hiding anything from potential buyers. That was the signal. Now, Kira whispered into her comm. The warehouse erupted in controlled chaos as GDF operatives breached from 3 directions. Stunner blasts lit up the dim space as the traffickers scrambled for weapons and escape routes. Kira threw herself behind a shipping crate, her heart hammering as she listened to shouted orders and the crash of bodies hitting concrete. Clear! Jackson's voice called out after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Kira, where are you? She emerged from her hiding spot to find him scanning the warehouse, his weapon still drawn. When he saw her, relief flooded his features and she felt the echo of it through their bond. The prisoners? She asked. Safe. Medical teams are checking them over now, and immigration services will help them get proper documentation. He holstered his weapon and pulled her into his arms. It's over. But as they watched the refugees being led to safety, Kira realized it wasn't over, it was beginning. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she had used her true abilities for something meaningful. She had helped her own people. 3 months later, Kira stood in the community center that had been converted into a refugee assistance facility. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as she conducted orientation for newly arrived families, explaining Earth customs and legal processes in 3 different languages. Her pale green skin was no longer hidden. The refugee community had embraced her as one of their own, and she had finally stopped pretending to be something she wasn't. The employment office is on the 2nd floor, she was explaining to a family of Altarian refugees when familiar arms slipped around her waist from behind. "How's the new job?" Jackson murmured against her ear. "Challenging. Rewarding. Right." She leaned back against his chest, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "How was your meeting with the council?" "They approved the expanded safe haven program. We'll be able to help twice as many people resettle safely." His voice carried satisfaction. Leading the new Refugee Protection Initiative had given him purpose again, a way to use his military experience for building rather than fighting. As the day's orientation session ended, they walked home together through the bustling city streets. Kira no longer flinched when people stared at her unusual appearance, some out of curiosity, others with the recognition of fellow outsiders who had found their place in the world. Their apartment was a blend of 2 cultures now. Jackson's practical, Earth furniture mixed with the few Zilani artifacts Kira had managed to save, creating a space that was uniquely theirs. On the balcony, her collection of Earth succulents grew alongside his herbs, while the star charts they'd mapped together covered one wall of the living room. That night, as they stood on their balcony looking up at the stars, Jackson pulled a small, velvet box from his pocket. "I know your people have different customs for bonding," he said, his voice carefully steady. "But I was hoping you might be willing to try the human version too." The ring inside was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a band of platinum set with a stone that seemed to capture starlight, holding it like a promise. But more than the jewelry, it was what the gesture represented, a human ritual offered with respect for her heritage, a bridge between their 2 worlds. "The stone," she said, her voice catching. "It's from a meteorite that originated in the Zilan system. I had it specially cut." His hands were trembling slightly as he held the box. "I wanted you to carry a piece of home with you always." Kira felt their bond sing with his love, his hope, his determination to build a life that honored both of their histories. Through her tears, she saw not just the man she loved, but the future they could create together, helping others find their place in the universe, building bridges between worlds, creating the kind of home that transcended species and planets. "Yes," she whispered, offering him her hand. "In every language, in every custom, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the stone caught the starlight streaming through the clear night sky, and Kira finally understood what home really meant. It wasn't a place you came from. It was the person you chose to build a life with, the community you served, the love that made you brave enough to be completely, authentically yourself. Above them, the stars that had once seemed impossibly distant now felt like old friends, witnesses to a love story that spanned galaxies and proved that even when worlds ended, new ones could always begin.